Welcome to The Green Rush, a podcast about the business of cannabis. On a weekly basis, hosts Ann Donahoe and Louis Goldberg talk with the CEOs, politicians, and cultural icons driving the cannabis industry forward. It seems like every week there's something big happening in the cannabis industry, and this week is no exception. The Cannabis World Congress and Business Expo kicks off in Los Angeles, and as we record this show, Louis is on his way there now. So Nick Opich will be filling in as co-host. Today, Ann and Nick are chatting with Alex Halperin, one of the first traditional reporters to truly own the cannabis beat. His Twitter bio says it best. He is quote unquote chasing the green rush for publications like The Guardian, where he has his own column called, appropriately enough, High Time. Besides his writing at The Guardian and for other publications, he also has his very own platform called WeedWeek, which publishes a very excellent email newsletter. We'll have all the information on how to find Alex's work in the show notes. So don't sit back, lean forward. And now on to our interview with Alex Halperin.
Thanks so much for being here, Alex. Wanted you to talk a little bit about how you got interested in the cannabis beat. What was your cannabis journey?
So, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
We're big fans of your work.
So I was a business reporter in New York, sort of a freelance business reporter, which maybe is another way to say an unemployed business reporter. But in any case, I had been writing about healthcare and tech and fracking and a bunch of different stories. And I had sort of been paying attention to marijuana legalization a little bit. This was in about 2013. I thought it was a neat idea. I wasn't a cannabis user at the time. Marijuana wasn't a part of my life, but I thought the whole phenomenon was pretty interesting. And this was still pretty early days. This was, I think, after Colorado and Washington had voted, but before the markets had opened, pretty much. And then the Colorado market opened. But Fast Company sent me to a convention in Las Vegas in November 2014, and it occurred to me that this was an amazing business story that really nobody was covering. And I mean, not just a business story, it's a cultural story. It's a as we say in WeedWeek, it's a multifaceted story, and I felt like nobody was giving it the kind of coverage it deserved. So I decided to take it up, and I moved to Denver a couple months after that.
That's incredible. And so we know everything that you're kind of going on WeedWeek, and we'll get a little bit more into that later. But another place where you're covering cannabis is with The Guardian. And that just is kind of amazing to me because, it's a British-based outlet. If you look back 5 years ago, this isn't a job. Like, a cannabis reporter isn't something that you would think that you would normally find. So can you talk about, like, that experience, like, contributing to a major media company covering cannabis and, like, kind of how they've been accepting of the industry and what the audiences are looking for when they read your stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, I write a column for The Guardian, and then I write freelance pieces for them as well. And the column is called High Time, which is pretty funny, I think. It wasn't I didn't come up with it. But, The Guardian has a global audience, probably a good portion of whom in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, Canada, and the US have tried cannabis at one point or another, but aren't necessarily familiar with how legalization is working. And I sort of see the column as a way to introduce folks to different aspects of legalization. So that can be anything from, I had a recent column on dabbing and dab culture, but also I've done political stories, business stories, health stories. And the idea is that this is such a multifaceted story, and my columns for them are sort of introducing readers to different facets of it. So, for example, right now, when is this going to be posted?
Probably. So we're recording on the 25th of September, probably 2 weeks.
Okay, so this story will probably be out by then. And if it's not, it's okay. So I'm writing a story about marijuana and the upcoming midterms, which it's an issue that politicians, whether they're for it or against it, don't really talk about, or most of them don't really talk about in a sophisticated way. But it's a real issue, and it doesn't necessarily cut the same way as most of the issues we're familiar with along the red-blue divide. So sort of an introduction to that. And it's a way to sort of introduce Guardian readers to something that's happening that, in my view, is going to be very, very hard to stop from reaching the UK, Canada, of course, Australia, and sort of keying them in on what they need to know.
Well, and I think what your column accomplishes is not just a 101. I mean, like you did a great column on CBD, and I think that's just such a confusing concept for a lot of people. Like, what is CBD? And so you do, it's almost like a college course on, what you need to know about things that terms you kind of hear flying about. And, so I think you do a really good job of that. And we'll make sure that we have a link to the column in the show notes, because it's really interesting even to go back. I was thumbing through past columns, and just the coverage has been great. So I'm excited to read the midterms column, because you kind of preempted our question here. Are there any, and I guess, being a British-based outlet, I mean, I know it's a global audience. Is there an appetite for what's going on in our midterms, in terms of this issue? I mean, I know that there's attention being paid, probably an unusual amount of attention, to a U.S. midterm this year for many reasons. Do you think that people are kind of wondering what's going on from the cannabis side, and what are you seeing, from candidates? Like, what are there any referendums you're watching closely, any candidates you're watching really closely that you're going to highlight?
So, yeah, I mean, nobody would say marijuana is one of the top sort of 5 issues, probably one of the top 20 issues at stake during the midterms. But it's a way to, it's an entry point to sort of talk about something bigger. And I mean, so I think one thing that's kind of interesting is that, now it's a pretty standard Democratic position to support marijuana legalization, but not that many Democrats are interested in really sort of talking up marijuana. They're not too comfortable saying what the industry would like them to say, which is that this is America's next great industry, and it's going to create all kinds of jobs, and it's a safer alternative to alcohol.
And it polls well. It's popular.
And it polls well. No, it absolutely polls well.
But they're not comfortable talking about it that way. So it's enough to, I wouldn't quite say wink. It's not like a dog whistle like you say about sort of appeals to racial grievance that or something like that. But it's more like, I think everybody understands where the Democrats are on legalization, and their support, the sort of people who support legalization are basically for it. And on the Republican side, they used to be the party of law and order, and I suppose still are, and still respect
war on drugs,
in some respects. But there are very few, if any, Republicans running for office who are talking loudly about just say no. I think instead they're sort of moderately endorsing it. So I think one example would be Pete Sessions, who's a Republican from Texas, no relation to Jeff Sessions, but he has been he's really infuriated legalization activists for a long time by, as the head of the Rules Committee in the House, he blocks bills from reaching a vote. And these have been on pretty modest bills like, allowing doctors to talk about it, like with veterans and stuff like that. But he recently met with parents who, a group, MAMA, I think is the acronym, but it's Mothers of Autistic Children, who want their children to either have access and more research into cannabis for treating autism. And Congressman Sessions, who is facing the first competitive race of his life against a former NFL player, Colin Allred. I believe he's a lawyer as well. And, Colin Allred supports legalization, but he's not, or supports certainly access for veterans. I'm not sure of his exact position, but he's not making a lot of noise about it. But meanwhile, Pete Sessions met with these mothers who want more access for their children with autism. So even this staunch opponent is willing to sort of move a little bit on this. The only, whereas in the administration, folks who don't have elected positions like Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, or I think the head of the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, I think his name is, they've all taken fairly strong anti-weed positions. But none of them have to answer directly to voters. And there's enough going on in the political climate that probably that nobody's voting for nobody's going to vote for Trump in 2020. Well, I shouldn't say that. It wasn't an issue in the 2016 presidential election. It was something where, again, Trump and Hillary both more or less agreed. So politicians are savvy to that.
So, Alex, I want to jump back to something. So, do you think the Democrats are missing their window on making cannabis legalization a truly progressive issue? Because I'm not sure if you talked with Lewis, who hosts this, and sometimes will get on a rant about it, but he truly believes that Donald Trump could do an October surprise and legalize cannabis right ahead of the midterms elections, just trying to sway something that way. So, and also that would be just a great way to cause a loss for the Democrats and make Chuck Schumer and the rest of that group just look like losers on this issue. So do you think the Democrats should be making cannabis legalization a midterm issue or a presidential issue in 2020?
Well, it's certainly true that Trump could do that. I wouldn't put anything past him. And I would also say that, Trump is famously a teetotaler. But I think that as a politician, he's the kind of politician who understands that he's not going to get anywhere by taking away the people's weed. Or as I said in one article that got killed, Donald Trump said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose any supporters, but he didn't say he could take away people's weed and not lose any supporters. I think he understands that.
Why did that get killed?
Because stories sometimes get killed. It wasn't the greatest story otherwise. I'll get it in someplace else, I'm sure. But no, I mean, the Democrats have made something of an issue of it. And anyone who's paying attention, I think, realizes that the Democrats, and anyone who's paying attention to this issue anyway, understands that the Democrats and Republicans have very different positions on it. I think the Republicans who favor it are now in favor of it in a very deregulated way. They don't talk about equity. Whereas
they make it a states' rights issue and, hands off my business and not a social justice issue.
Exactly. I mean, you can make a pretty compelling sort of Republican case for legalization, and that's what they're doing. Whereas the Democrats have a much different approach. Some Democrats, there's a bill that was put forward by Cory Booker that's has much more about restitution for communities that were damaged in the war on drugs and things like that. And the Republicans these days really aren't in the business of even talking about what are essentially affirmative action programs. That's just not what they're about. So, and I argued in Slate that the industry could find its political home in the Republican Party because they're an industry and the Republicans are more business friendly.
Well, and I think that the acceptance seems to be shifting. So the one of the largest consumer groups of cannabis are now baby boomers. And so I think, as the demographics shift and get older and, people have lots of aches and pains and are finding remedies here, they're kind of changing their ideas. So this kind of, I feel like there's times that I feel like this is, the Republicans' issue to lose, but maybe that's just me being really cynical.
No, I think you're basically right. Like the Republicans have I think the strongest opposition to legalization is among seniors, but they're also the fastest growing group of users. So there's really no political upside in running hard against marijuana, and really nobody is.
So you talk to a lot of sources and CEOs and advocates. Are there any who have stood out to you, and they could be politicians too, as particularly visionary, on this issue, or like, wow, they like this person just has their shit together, and I want to make sure I follow their career? Is there anyone or people that are standing out to you that are underrepresented?
Well, one thing I've heard is, as I said before, even the Democrats who support legalization, not too many of them are saying, this is healthier than alcohol. This is a major jobs creator. This is like an American industry of the future. My state senator, I believe, Kevin De Leon, who's currently an underdog running for California Senate to the left of Dianne Feinstein, the longtime California senator, I've seen him talk about how this is a real jobs creating opportunity. And he gives marijuana he gives cannabis a much more full-throated endorsement than even most Democrats are comfortable with. Although I don't remember him saying anything along the lines of, this is something beneficial. I don't think anybody's saying that. But I think his willingness to recognize the jobs issue he's really sort of on the forefront of that. But there are quite a few others as well.
So one way that a lot of cannabis jobs can be created, though, is if the U.S. actually legalizes it. So I gave you Lewis's perspective where he thinks it could happen in October. I think we're a couple of years down the line in the U.S., probably until 2021 at the earliest, for actual cannabis legalization in the U.S. What do you believe that timeline is?
Oh, man, I really don't know. Whereas Trump could do that, I don't even know if it's sort of within Trump's power, the president's power, sort of with a stroke of a pen to legalize.
Reschedule or deschedule.
Yeah. I think there's a possibility of a real sort of federally, a shift in federal law before 2020. I don't know if that's full legalization or if it's sort of giving the okay to the state industries and giving the okay to banking.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Banking would be the big issue there.
And perhaps dealing with the industry hated tax rule 280E. That's pretty much bipartisan. It's an unfair tax. Anybody who's looked at it sort of recognizes that. I think issues like that could be cleared up by 2020, and Trump could very much see that as part of his reelection effort.
Well, by the time this episode hits, we'll be about a week out from the day Canada goes legal on October 17th. Do you think that's going to play any role in getting the U.S. to speed up with it? I mean, we're already seeing like Tilray is going to be importing cannabis for medical research when we could clearly just be growing that cannabis, or it's already being grown here in the U.S. Like, is the Canada legalization effort going to play any role on the U.S.?
I mean, it's got to in some way. I think the really crazy thing is that this border issue isn't resolved yet. So that, technically, and this happens, any non-American citizen, any foreign citizen, foreign national who enters the U.S. can be banned for life if they've ever used cannabis. Now, probably close to half of Canadians have tried cannabis. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, acknowledged smoking weed when he was in Parliament. And that it's a very crazy situation, I think, that this isn't going to be resolved. And that for Canadians crossing the border, whether they're in the industry or not, this is going to be an ongoing issue. I mean, it's good for the Canadian immigration lawyers, but it's kind of a nutty situation, and it's hard to, unless it's only very loosely enforced, it's hard to see how this is going to develop.
I mean, but we've known people who are now, they've become reticent to cross the border because they're, very publicly either investing in or working in the industry, and they like their global entry. And they just kind of don't want the hassle, which it just seems so stupid.
Yeah, I get it. It's a sense of, Canada is a wealthy industrialized nation, and they're having to experience some fraction of what visitors and immigrants from less wealthy nations have to experience.
Right. So, we're talking about this booming industry and certainly the potential of an even boomier industry. I think I made up a word. But do you think that there's, and we talked a little bit about this, that the cannabis industry could be following in the footsteps of the internet boom of the 90s? Like, do you see any similarities? Are there, are there any red flags that you're seeing that you're like, okay, we've been through this before, let's not do it again?
I mean, there are all sorts of ways. I with all of these sort of economic frenzies, like the dot-com bubble or the green rush, and going way back when, they're all based, or most of them anyway, are based on real economic demand. You could see when the dot-com busted that it wasn't like the internet was going to go away. It was just that this class of companies that operated in a way that was hubristic, or it wasn't necessarily hubristic, but the companies didn't succeed. But the internet didn't go anywhere, and the internet has of course thrived, and based on that ruin. So I think there's the same thing with cannabis. Demand for cannabis is going to increase, and with legalization and with companies really, and the industry as a whole, sort of really marketing cannabis as part of a normal life or a healthy life, demand is going to increase because people are going to try it and be like, wow, well, that's okay. And maybe it helps them, or maybe they just enjoy it. And so they're going to keep using it. But that doesn't mean all the companies providing it are going to be successful. There are a lot of wrenching changes, and they're being hit in all kinds of different ways. A lot of companies aren't going to make it.
So, I want to jump back. You had briefly brought up your recent piece on the concentrates, and just really on the growing popularity of concentrates, and dabbing and stuff. And this echoes something we've seen and heard as well, that traditional flower is just falling out of vogue for the legal industry. So what do you think's driving that? When you were doing your research on this story, what did you find? Was it new users are joining the space and looking for something different than just rolling a joint, or is it traditional users looking for new ways to enjoy their cannabis?
I mean, the industry's been pretty good at trying to change sort of perceptions of marijuana users. And so part of that is new forms, but flower has several disadvantages as sort of a modern product, and also sort of as a reminder of these stereotypes that the industry wants to sort of dissolve. And so flower is messy, it smells, you can't really do it discreetly, and concentrates in like a vape pen or edibles, and so many of the other products are really much more conducive to the way people live now. And also I think the perception, a lot of cannabis users don't want to be perceived as stoners, and a vape pen makes that a lot easier. Now, of course, with other kinds of concentrates, you can get a dab rig and you can get every bit as obsessive and messy, and talk about the different dabs for as long as you want to. But that's a pretty small subset of the community. And so just, I think the new products, including concentrates, are better at appealing to modern and non-traditional cannabis users.
So this may be a little philosophical, but what do you think is the most underreported story in the industry? Or maybe let me put it this way: has there been a story that you've written that you felt like, and published, that people just haven't paid that much attention to?
I think the most underreported story, and it should be said that while I'm the columnist for The Guardian, almost none of the major American media outlets have somebody covering the business of cannabis full time.
Do you think that's going to change?
What?
Do you think that'll change anytime soon?
Well, nobody's hired me. So I think there's still, among sort of on the East Coast, sort of on the New York, DC axis, there's a fair amount of disinterest. And that's, the media is otherwise occupied, and which is understandable, of course, and of course has had all sorts of business problems. But I don't think anybody really knows how well the state programs are working. And what I mean by that is, in just about all the states, you can get, really attractively, or in a lot of states anyway, you can get attractively packaged products. The edible dosing is almost certainly way more consistent than it was 3 or 4 years ago, so you're not going to you're much less likely to have an unpleasant experience than maybe you would have a couple of years ago. But nobody really knows who's making money, if the money is being reported, where the money is going. And in a lot of these cases, because of the lack of the federal government and being involved, and the lack of the sort of investigative arm of the media, we're basically just taking the state's word for it. And some states have sort of sounded the alarm, like Oregon has more or less sounded the alarm. But other states are like, oh yeah, everything is doing fine. And we really don't know. And it's going to be a really hard problem to solve once, say, the federal government starts to pay attention to that.
And do you think that's a function of, because you're right, and certainly we've experienced that cannabis itself gets kind of bunched into, a business reporter's beat or not even an investigative reporter's beat, but, do you think that just there's such this scarcity and no one's really paying attention because it's not, relatively speaking, it's not a huge tax, revenue for a state. It's a lot, it's good, but it's not anything that's really that impactful yet. Do you think it's just a matter of time, or do you think it's going to take someone really screwing something up for the rest of the country to pay attention?
It's interesting. Nobody has really screwed it up, and so far. As I think I've said somewhere, there hasn't been any sort of national tragedy that has sort of focused the nation. And to some degree, that's shows how safe cannabis is, at least in its acute effects, meaning, you're much less likely to ruin your life after getting stoned than after getting drunk. We haven't had any school bus drivers get stoned and drive over cliffs or anything like that. But also it's that we have this new industry, which is totally unique in a lot of respects. It has ongoing ties to sort of the criminal world. It operates in a way that no other industry has ever operated in. And each state has basically been making it up as they go along. So they're all trying hard, but it's really hard to tell how well they're working. And there's really been, every state, of course, has its own industry, and we don't see much coordination between them or anything like that. It's just that you have a dozen or more states. Basically, every state is at some stage in this process, but say 15 states with sort of where this is really in play, and they're all sort of figuring this out on their own. So it's very hard to get any sense of what's going on nationally. And because there are so many, it seems, I think maybe some of the folks who might investigate it, they might focus on one or two states.
Well, there's also, I'm sorry.
Please continue.
No, I was going to say, and there's no universal metric. There's no benchmark. Like you said, that this is, the rules are being written right now. They're on smudgy pieces of paper. So there's not, I would imagine as a reporter, that's got to be really difficult. I mean, when I don't know, companies like WorldCom or those, the big, tech companies that just crashed, there were paper trails, there were, benchmarks but there's just not that infrastructure yet, it seems like.
True. No, exactly. So it's very hard. And, right now the business climate is so hard with 280E and, the constantly changing web of regulations. And there's a lot of temptation for business owners to offload product onto the illegal market or not report their earnings or do whatever it is they have to do to stay afloat. And we just have very little idea how common that is, how much of it is going on, and whether, there certainly have been busts by the states. I'm not trying to criticize the states, but it's just a very difficult process.
So, Alex, we've mentioned it a couple of times, and just for some of our listeners who may not be familiar, you're the founder of WeedWeek. So can you give us the update on everything you guys are doing? Like, I have your newsletter. If you don't already subscribe to Alex's WeedWeek newsletter, make sure you're signing up. But can you give us an update on everything that's going on over there?
Sure. So, yes. So WeedWeek, it's a newsletter I started in July 2015. And you can sign up for free at weedweek.net. And we started a podcast earlier this year, and we did it for about 6 months. And Haley and I think we had some good episodes. We had a nice time, but we split up for boring business reasons. But she's on to another project, and of course I wish her the best of luck with that. But anyway, so we'll be relaunching the podcast with a new co-host, and it'll probably be announced once this podcast comes out. But so I'm gonna say our new co-host is Donnell Alexander. He's a journalist based in Los Angeles. He's a pretty cool guy.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
And we should be back up and running by the time this is out. We also launched, and he'll be writing WeedWeek California as well, which is going to be more focused on professionals in California. We have Jesse Staniforth writing WeedWeek Canada, and pretty soon, it may even be out by the time this comes out, but we're in the middle of a redesign process that we think is going to really up our game a lot, and we'll be hosting a party to announce this is the plan anyway. I'll let you know if this changes.
Everyone's invited.
But we're hosting a party at the convention in Vegas, so we hope you can stop by. And yeah, we're gonna, WeedWeek is based on the premise that the least interesting thing about marijuana is what happens after you smoke it. Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with smoking it, but that what we find more interesting are the politics, the business, the health and science, the criminal justice, and the cultural aspects surrounding this amazing phenomenon, which is primarily a business phenomenon, the green rush, but is also a phenomenon which is going to touch on all aspects of American life and try and keep up with that.
And do you have any details that you can drop? I know the date recently was changed, but on Recharge 2019, the conference you guys are setting up?
Yes. So we're setting up a conference. It'll be in Los Angeles in February. I think it's February 8th or 9th. We had to, and we're going to have some great speakers. And I think one of the things about the industry, which I've found sort of surprising, is it's pretty buttoned up. It's pretty corporate. And our party's not going to be, it's going to be fun and engaging. And I think business people are going to get value in it. But it's also going to be cool and fun. And we want people to have a good time. And instead of being in a big convention center, it's going to be in a pretty cool spot in LA, and we're going to have a good crowd. So we hope you can make it.
Well, I think you should probably come back on and talk about it when we're closer to that. So
I would be happy to.
Cool. So
I should also say with WeedWeek that one thing that sort of sets us apart from a lot of other publications in cannabis is that we strive to replicate the separation of business and editorial operations as reputable news organizations do. So we have Adrian Nascimento has done an amazing job as the head of our business development. With some of the weed publications out there, it's hard to tell what's paid content and what isn't paid content, and there are a lot of blurry lines there. And as a result, you don't quite know what you can trust. And at WeedWeek, in our very small shop, we make every effort to separate that as definitively as possible and create the sort of established channels of journalistic credibility, which undoubtedly doing this has cost us money to this point, but we believe that because we can't be bought, it will be a business asset going into the future.
You respect the wall.
Exactly.
Nice. So every week we ask our guests to participate in a segment we call Puff Puff Pass. And we ask them in rapid fire, give us 2 things you love about the industry and 1 thing that you absolutely hate about the industry. So Alex, Puff Puff Pass.
Okay, well, 2 things I love. 1 thing I love about the industry, you know, I love it that it's this sort of unique and very American phenomenon of people getting together and just making things happen and trying to make money, which is, you know, it's exciting to watch this sort of spring up and all the improvising that's necessarily and people trying to achieve something and putting aside their differences. And it's something I think it's nice to see in our very divided country right now. And I've met another thing I like. I've met a lot of really interesting people. I've been people who are smart and tenacious and really, I don't necessarily agree with them on everything, but they're dedicated and they're excited and they're working to change the world, and that's pretty inspiring. 1 thing I don't like is I don't like the amount of disinformation. I don't like all the unproven health claims that are being made. The fastest way to get me to lose interest in a company is to tell me that, like, you're about something else, something different than all the other marijuana companies. It's all marijuana. And I think companies should basically recognize that. And like I was talked to a company the other day. I was supposed to write a story about it, and I won't name them, but I dropped the story essentially because they kept saying, well, we're about health and wellness and nobody else is. When really I've been hearing that pitch for 4 years, pretty much nonstop. So, you know, and also just promoting health benefits of marijuana that are unproven. I think so far it hasn't really created too many problems that we know about that have really sort of bubbled to news level, but I don't think it's a good thing. And I think people should be honest about why people use cannabis for recreational reasons and for medical reasons. I think both are legitimate to some extent, and the cannabis world should try and be honest about them.
You know, that's the first time we've heard that's the disinformation as a pass. So I think that's really interesting, and definitely, you know, we see it in some of the smaller trades and some of the, you know, the smaller companies trying to make a name for themselves, that they're the cure for cancer or, you know, the next best thing since insert whatever drug, and that always gives me pause too. So thanks for talking about that.
And also, I mean, I feel like you know, for example, there's a lot of speculation about cannabis benefiting people with PTSD, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but there's not that much of what we would call sort of credible scientific evidence. And, you know, people with PTSD are in pretty fraught condition, and I certainly hope their cannabis use is benefiting them. But I think they should be able to get more accurate information on what it is and isn't doing for them. And right now, that's very hard, and it is probably to the detriment of some patients.
Well, our enormous thanks to you, Alex. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We are fans of your work. We're excited to put all of your work in our show notes, and we hope you come back to talk about the conference early next year.
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Our enormous thanks to Alex Halperin, founder of WeedWeek and cannabis reporter and columnist for The Guardian. His column is called High Time, and it's high time you check it out. See what I did there? Follow him on Twitter at Alex Halperin, AlexHalperin. And we'll have links to all of his work in our show notes. Please make sure to check it out. If you want to chat with us, you can always find us on Instagram and Twitter with the handle at KCSA_cannabis, as well as at KCSA-cannabis.com, or drop us an email at greenrush@kcsa.com. We would love your thoughts, and if you have a guest idea, stick it on in there too. Don't forget to subscribe to The Green Rush in your favorite podcatcher. Bye for now. One take, Shay. One take.